One of the most significant and dramatic moments of the 2025 Formula One Brazilian Grand Prix was undoubtedly the incident that occurred at the very first corner, Turn 1, during the restart that took place at the beginning of the sixth lap, following the deployment of the safety car. It was one of those chaotic racing episodes that completely changed the narrative of a Grand Prix within seconds. Anyone who watched the race live has probably replayed the scene multiple times, analyzing every camera angle and piece of onboard footage. The moment unfolded when young Mercedes driver Andrea Kimi Antonelli, restarting from second place on the grid, failed to get the ideal acceleration as the race resumed. His Mercedes W16 car lacked traction off the line, while Charles Leclerc immediately took advantage of the situation by pulling alongside him on the outside line. At the same time, McLaren driver Oscar Piastri saw an opening on the inside and went for a bold move. The three cars approached the braking zone side by side, and the tension was palpable. As the drivers fought for position, the McLaren and the Mercedes made contact, sending Andrea Kimi Antonelli spinning sideways and directly into the path of Charles Leclerc's Ferrari. The Monegasque driver was the main victim of this clash, having absolutely no fault in the collision. His Ferrari SF25 sustained heavy damage, and his race was over almost immediately. The stewards quickly reviewed the footage and decided to hand Oscar Piastri a 10-second time penalty. Their reasoning was clear and based on established FIA guidelines. The Australian driver did not have his front axle aligned with the mirrors of Antonelli's Mercedes, a critical reference point that determines whether an inside car has earned the right to claim the corner. As a result, the stewards concluded that Oscar Piastri was not sufficiently alongside to be entitled to space. The decision was justified from a regulatory standpoint, but it also had serious consequences for the McLaren driver's title hopes, which moved even further away after this setback. Charles Leclerc, however, expressed a slightly different view when he spoke after the race. The Ferrari driver, clearly frustrated by an early and undeserved retirement, suggested that the blame should not fall solely on Oscar Piastri. In his opinion, both Andrea Kimi Antonelli and the Australian driver shared responsibility for the crash. Charles Leclerc implied that the accident was avoidable and that Antonelli could have done more to prevent it. He argued that the young Mercedes driver turned into the corner as if the McLaren wasn't there at all, which in his view made the Italian partially responsible for what happened. Essentially, Charles Leclerc pointed out that even though the FIA guidelines indicate that a driver attempting an overtake on the inside must be fully alongside up to the level of the mirrors, failing to reach that reference point should not mean the leading car can simply ignore the presence of another competitor. It was a nuanced and reasonable perspective, and one that deserved a deeper analysis. When reviewing the replay footage, onboard cameras, and telemetry data, the situation indeed appears borderline and complex. The data confirms that Andrea Kimi Antonelli's restart was far from perfect. His Mercedes showed lower speed compared to those around him, and he was forced to lift off the throttle shortly after applying it because the rear wheels lost traction due to excessive aggressiveness. That small mistake opened the door for Charles Leclerc, who immediately positioned his Ferrari on the outside line, slightly ahead, while Oscar Piastri approached rapidly on the inside. However, since the Australian had started from a few car lengths back, he never quite managed to get his McLaren fully beyond the midpoint of the Italian's Mercedes. It's also evident that Kimi Antonelli saw Oscar Piastri only partially. The Italian driver later admitted a revealing detail in his post-race interview with Sky Italia, explaining that when he hit the brakes, he didn't see Oscar anymore because he thought he had already braked. That sentence says a lot about what went wrong. It confirms, in essence, what Charles Leclerc had suggested, that the Mercedes driver turned into the corner under the assumption that the McLaren had already backed out of the move. His visibility was limited, and he simply didn't expect the Australian to still be there. Telemetry data also shows that Oscar Piastri did, in fact, brake earlier than both Charles Leclerc and Andrea Kimi Antonelli, a point that the McLaren driver himself emphasized afterward when he explained that the two cars on the outside braked very late. However, even though he braked earlier, he didn't manage to slow down enough to stay completely in control. A small front-wheel lockup made the situation worse, reducing both the car's braking efficiency and its turning capability. From Piastri's onboard camera, it's clearly visible that the Mercedes's rear left wheel hits the McLaren's front right. It's a longitudinal contact, meaning Kimi Antonelli was already turning in at full speed, while Piastri's car, struggling with reduced steering response, was still trying to decelerate and hold the line. This sequence effectively supports Charles Leclerc's interpretation that Kimi Antonelli shared at least some practical responsibility, even if, under the letter of the law, he was not to blame. The FIA's current racing guidelines on overtaking are clear. A driver attempting to overtake on the inside must be significantly alongside by the time they reach the apex, meaning their front axle should be at least level with the rival's mirrors. The goal of this rule is to discourage so-called dive bombs, risky late-braking maneuvers, where the following car attempts to squeeze into a gap that barely exists. These are often situations where the driver ahead has no realistic way to see or anticipate the attack. When such moves go wrong, the result is typically contact that spins around the leading car while the attacking one escapes relatively unscathed. This pattern is exactly what we witnessed in this case, and it's not new. The same dynamic appeared earlier in the sprint race during the incident between Liam Lawson and Oliver Bearman, and even more dramatically in this collision between Oscar Piastri and Andrea Kimi Antonelli. Once again, the Mercedes spun around following contact, but was stopped, almost miraculously, by Charles Leclerc's Ferrari, which took the full impact. Oscar Piastri, on the other hand, continued almost unharmed and even gained a temporary position. It's a scenario widely seen as unfair among both fans and drivers. Similar incidents have occurred multiple times in the past, one notable example being the collision between Lewis Hamilton and Alexander Albon at Interlagos in 2021, which followed an almost identical pattern. Seen in this broader context, the penalty imposed on Oscar Piastri makes perfect sense. The Australian never truly got alongside Andrea Kimi Antonelli, and he didn't manage to slow the car enough to stay out of trouble. The steward's decision, therefore, was entirely consistent with the regulations. Still, it's easy to understand why Piastri attempted the move. He saw a brief gap, a small window of opportunity created by Antonelli's poor restart, and as any racing driver would, he went for it, but unfortunately, it didn't work out. Charles Leclerc's comments, however, remain valid and in many ways constructive. His criticism of Kimi Antonelli wasn't personal, but rather educational. It served as a reminder that racing awareness and spatial judgment are just as important as speed and bravery. The Italian may not have been guilty in regulatory terms, but as the Ferrari driver pointed out, his decision-making could have been better. If Charles Leclerc's Ferrari hadn't been positioned on the outside to absorb the impact, Kimi Antonelli's Mercedes would likely have spun completely and ended up facing the wrong direction, dropping him to the very back of the field and ruining his entire race. Charles Leclerc, being an experienced driver, had instinctively taken a wide line through turn 1 to stay clear of any chaos, but in the end, it sadly wasn't enough to avoid disaster. All in all, Charles Leclerc was right to describe the whole situation as unnecessary and avoidable. It was an unfortunate chain of events that could have easily been prevented with just a bit more caution and awareness from everyone involved. For Ferrari and Charles Leclerc, the Brazilian Grand Prix will remain a bitter memory of how unpredictable and unfair racing can sometimes be.